men use the image of female perfection to motivate themselves. And that's exactly right. That's precisely what they do. You see that in the Tom Sawyer story. So Tom Sawyer is about 12 years old, and he's still hanging around with his friends like Huck Finn. And this girl moves across the street, Becky, and she comes out, and he's struck by her for the first time in his life. Something's changed. And the first thing he does is hop up on a picket fence and show off and balance in front of her. And he's saying, well, look at me, look at me. He's like the male bowerbird building something beautiful so the female will approve of it. And it's motivation. You know, and that's something that I think modern women don't really understand about men. They don't understand that, at least to the degree that males are uncorrupted and not bitter because of being rejected, they're doing everything they can to kneel before the eternal image of the feminine and try to make themselves worthy. That's the chivalry story, right? That's what you should encourage in your partner. So out of chaos emerges this first form. It's the feminine form. It's partly the form that represents novelty as such. So, and on one hand it's promise, on the other hand it's threat. That you wouldn't believe, and I don't know, because I don't understand the situation with women as well as I understand the situation with men, obviously being a man. But I don't know if women have any idea how paralyzing they are to especially young men. A very large number of my clinical clients, but also young men I've talked to in general, are absolutely terrified of women because they're terrified of being rejected. And the terror exists in precise proportion to the attraction to the woman, which is a horrible paradoxical situation to be in. It's often why men make such fools of themselves in front of women that they're attracted to. It's because, first of all, they don't see the woman that they're attracted to, because what the hell do they know about her? They don't see her as an individual. They see her as the manifestation of a judgmental ideal. And then it's only in establishing the relationship with the actual woman that they can start differentiating between the judgmental ideal and the actual individual woman. And that also requires a sacrifice. And the sacrifice is, you never can have an ideal woman. So to have a relationship with any woman, you have to sacrifice the relationship with the ideal woman, and you have to see the individual woman and separate her from the ideal. And that's the same thing that happens to the hero in Sleeping Beauty, right? He sees the evil queen who actually turns into the dragon of chaos, and it's not until he can defeat her that he can establish a relationship with the actual princess. And that's exactly the case. I had one of my clients who ran this men's group, which was quite interesting. One of the things they had the initiates do, which was very intelligent, was to go out and ask 50 women in one day for their phone numbers. Why? Politely, properly, you know. It was a game, but it wasn't a stupid game. And the idea was, get over your fear of rejection. And how do you do that? By encountering it continually and continually and continually, so that you're no longer paralyzed by this. And then this, so that's the positive feminine on the left. And then on the right, that's the Gorgon, and that's the thing that fills you with terror when you look at it. There's another representation of the positive feminine. It's another representation of Mary. There are representations very much like this of Isis with Horus on her lap. And people often consider those precursors, they're Egyptian statues, precursors to the Christian iconography. And, well, I suppose in some sense they are, insofar as they predated them in time, but the fundamental issue is that, well, this image has to be held up as transcendent, and by that I mean it's an image that's got to be at the basis of a value structure that actually works insofar as there's going to be human beings, because there aren't any human beings without the infant and the mother. And so if that's not held up as an image of ultimate value, then everything falls apart. And it's something our culture does extraordinarily badly. I had a client recently admit to me in ashamed tones that she wanted to have children. I said, well, you don't have to be ashamed of that, especially not if you're talking to me. And she said, oh, that's such a relief, because I can't talk to anyone about it at work. They seem to think that it's, degrading. I thought, that you can hardly diagnose a culture as more pathological than that. That's so appalling, and it's so hard. It's one of the things I really feel badly for young women, because they're not guided through this with any sense whatsoever. And I'll tell you what my experience has been working with women, and you can take this for what it's worth. And I've worked with women who've achieved the highest levels of their profession, I don't mean just in academia, but in a number of different fields, this is what happens. We'll take the typical woman, conservative woman, because they're more typical, conscientious, not particularly open, so they're dutiful people, you know, they're existing within the structures of their society. So I'll take female lawyers as a classic example. So they're very good at high school, very hardworking, very intelligent, but very dutiful, and often rather agreeable. And that's important because it means to some degree that they want to please and they'll do what they're told. And so part of the reason I think that women are outperforming men in elementary, junior high school and university is because they're more likely to be obedient. And I know that to some degree because we did analysis of students in Quebec and found out that one thing that predicted grades over and above intelligence and conscientiousness was agreeableness, and agreeable people got better grades than their IQ and conscientiousness would predict. And that's particularly negative for men. So imagine this is what's happening. So you're a borderline student and you're also a bit rebellious and antisocial. I'm going to fail you. Like you're right on the cusp. Don't like you much. You fail. You have exactly the same grade profile, but I like you. Tick. You move ahead. You don't. And so one of the things that's dividing men from women as they progress through school is the degree to which they're agreeable. Now that works out to some degree for women insofar as the agreeableness moves them forward, but they encounter the negative elements of being agreeable later in their careers. Anyways, their women are very good in high school, then they go to college, they're very good in college, they nail their damn grades, they do their studying, they get their A's and they ace their LSAT, so they're smart too. Then they go off to do their articling and they're really, really good at it. And then they get offered an associate position and they're really, really good at it, and then by the time they're 30 they make partner, and let's say they're in high pressure, high paying jobs. $250,000 a year, $300,000 a year, $500 an hour. Okay, what's your life like? You work all the time, period. 70 hours a week, 75 hours a week, flat out, and you don't get to make any mistakes. And if your client calls you at 3 in the morning on Sunday, you say, I'm really glad to hear from you, because if you don't, there's some hot law firm in New York that'll take your client from you at a moment's notice. And the client is paying you, whatever, the firm, $750 an hour, of which maybe you get $350, and what they want is an answer about something really complicated right bloody now. And you can say all you want about the fact that women have a difficult time with that because it's a male-dominant patriarchy. Any female lawyer who's hit 30 and is a partner that has any sense at all knows that's complete bloody rubbish. It's market determined right to the core. What happens to the women when they're in their 30s? They all leave the high-end law firms. Why? Because who in their right mind would want to live like that? That's the issue, right? Once you make about $60,000 a year for your family, but let's say for you personally, additional income has zero impact on your quality of life. Zero. So why work 80 hours a week? Well, men will do it. Some men, very few. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. Relationships, family, children, way in the second category. And so those men are often very difficult to live with too, because they're so obsessed with their career. It's hard to have a relationship with them. And maybe they don't have much of a relationship with their kids, but they're damn good at what they do. And part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession. And that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. Well, they're often also disagreeable too, because you want to manage people? Really? They're not going to like you. You know, and it's not an easy thing to not be liked. And actually, if you're an agreeable person, and women are more agreeable than men, it's quite painful to be disliked. But if you're in a managerial and executive position, the probability that people are going to like you is quite low. Now, if you're a real son of a bitch, then they're going to dislike you more. But those positions are very stressful, partly because of the interpersonal dynamics, and they're also incredibly, incredibly competitive. So the women hit that at 30 and they're completely qualified, and the law firms are bloody desperate to keep them, because it's really hard to find highly qualified people, especially once you've put all that time into training them, especially if they're also good at bringing in business. The law firms trip over themselves to try to keep them. They can't. The women think, why in the world am I doing this? Why in the world would anyone in their right mind do this? Especially because they're often married by that point too, and generally they've married a husband who makes as much money or more than them. So they don't need the damn money. And so they think, well, there's more to life than this, which is exactly the right thing to think. And so they go and find a job that's 9 to 5 and controllable so that they can hire a nanny and have some kids and have a life. And it's like, yes, that's the intelligent thing to do. So we've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done. Right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that and maybe you don't. So what I don't know what people think is these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right? From a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees non-stop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, you know, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40 and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man, I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, you know, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist. Well, you know that wages have been flat, except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes 2 people to make as much as 1 did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited to where they were relatively unlimited and there were 2 incomes, to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women, because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening. So, and you think when you're 19, because you're so clueless when you're 19, you don't know a bloody thing, you think, well, I'm not really sure I want children anyways. It's like, oh yeah, you can tell how well you've been educated. Jesus, dismal. Dismal. Without fail, I got to tell you, without fail, I've watched women go through their professional careers, many of them. It's a very rare woman who at the age of 30 doesn't consider having a child her primary desire. And the ones that don't consider that, generally, in my observation, there's something that isn't quite right in the way that they're constituted or looking at the world. Sometimes you get women who are truly non-maternal, you know, by temperament. They have a masculine temperament, disagreeable, they're not particularly compassionate, they're not maternal, they're not that interested in kids. Fair enough, man. But there aren't that many of them, and there's plenty who will not admit to themselves that that's what they most desperately want.
Do you think women would be better off if they had kids earlier, focused on career, say in their 30s?
Who knows? Like it really is a problem.
Like a more rational decision to me.
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that because
I mean, if you're 35 and your kids are say 10, 11,
yeah.
then you can go get a bachelor's degree, get your master's.
Well,
It seems more easy that way
yeah.
than having the career first and then trying to raise young kids.
Yeah, I can't answer that because I've seen women do a good job of it both ways. And you do get the odd woman who manages a high-powered career and kids, but Jesus, those women, man, like they buy more powerful microwaves because it'll take 45 seconds to cook the food instead of a minute. And I'm not kidding. It's like they're up at 5, they exercise for half an hour, they make breakfast, they get their kids ready to work, they go to work, they work 14-hour days, flat bloody out. They come home and work for another 2 hours to get their kids organized. They have a nanny to help them out, and then they work for 2 more hours before they go to bed at like 1, and then they're up at 5 and they do that again. And I'll tell you, you better be tough if you're going to do that, physically too, because you'll just burn yourself to a crisp. I've seen some women manage it, you know, but they're tough and they're rare because that's a hell of a regimen. And then if anything goes wrong, you know, you have a sick kid or something like that, or there's any sort of crisis in your family, it's just, you know, then it becomes too much. And I don't know the answer to that, you know. I mean, the advantage women have is they live about 8 years longer than men because testosterone kills men. So,
But they have a limited time span to have children.
well, that's right. They pay up front and gain in the long run. But it isn't clear how our society should sort this out. We don't know, and it's partly we don't know what to do now that women have control of their reproductive function. It's a big mystery. Yep.
I don't have an answer to that either. But I think from a practical aspect, and this goes for both men and women, even if women were to enter the workforce later on, they'd be at competition with people who are younger, and that's always a conflict in the workforce. Like people are always hiring younger talent because of how long they can be in the workforce.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and the thing is, young stupid people have the advantage of being young. Middle-aged stupid people have the disadvantage of being middle-aged. And so if you're going to hire a young stupid person or a middle-aged stupid person, you'll go for the young stupid person. And by stupid, I mean, you know, I'm being sarcastic, obviously, but I mean without experience and just getting started in the world. You're much more likely to favor someone young because there's an instant explanation for their relative cluelessness. And it's a problem, you know. So I don't know what the answer is, but one answer certainly is, at least in part, is to start letting young women know what being 30 and being female is like, and also to disabuse them of the notion that there's something magical about a career. First of all, most people don't have careers, man. They have jobs. And the reason you get paid for a job is because you're being asked to do things you wouldn't do unless you were being paid. And so it's not some utopia of cigar smoking with your boots up on your desk. That's for sure. Not that would be such a utopia to begin with. One of the things about human beings that's unique is that human females are picky maters. They're choosy. They're also sneaky because you can't tell when they're ovulating, and with many other female animals, you know. They have hidden ovulation and they're choosy, and they tend to choose men who are more successful in the dominance hierarchy. Well, there's a shock. I mean, if you pick someone who's at the bottom of the competence hierarchy, well, that's probably not going to work out very well for you. And since women bear the burden of reproduction, it's perfectly reasonable for them to search out someone who's going to be helpful. So productive, fair, generous. And you know, when you think of a dominance hierarchy, you might think, well, it's the powerful guy, the aggressive guy, say, that rises to the top of the dominance hierarchy. And that's not true. It's not even true among chimps. Like, you can get a chimp tyrant, but then what happens is other chimps gang up on him and tear him to pieces. And they don't do it nicely. They don't do it nicely. And the chimps that tend to maintain their dominance for long periods of time have a pretty wide network of friends, roughly speaking, with whom they engage in reciprocal interactions like grooming, and they actually pay a lot of positive attention to the female chimps, who have their own hierarchy, by the way, and to their offspring. So they're like baby kissing politicians. And so the idea that it's raw power that produces dominance it's just wrong. It's wrong now, you know, tyrants, you know, it's a pretty damn unstable business being a tyrant. There's lots of people who want to kill you. Plus, you know, you tend to rule over something approximating hell. So maybe that's a bit worse better than being a subject in hell, but it's not much better. Anyway, so this social. Now, so what this means, think about this for a minute. You know, imagine that what I'm telling you bears some vague resemblance to the truth. I think there's quite a lot of evidence for it from a biological perspective. I mean, this choosy mating thing occurs with lots of species, you know. There's this bird called the bowerbird. You got to look up bowerbirds, man. Those things are, you just can't even believe they exist. And so the male bowerbird, he makes this really complicated nest that's close to the ground. He weaves it. It's really quite nice. You couldn't make one. So, and then he sweeps the yard in front of the nest, and then he runs around the forest, or flies, because he is a bird, finding pretty things. So maybe he'll find a nice collection of red leaves, and so then he'll take the red leaves one by one and fly back to his front yard and make a little square. You know, he's a bird, so it's not a great square, but he makes a little patch of red, and he takes a look at that, and then he goes off and finds something blue, and he decorates. He makes a little piece of abstract art in the front of his nest. And a lot of male bowerbirds do this all at the same time. And so then the females come along, they hop on something nearby, and they kind of look at it like this, checking it out. And if they're happy with it, well, then things proceed. But if they're not, they fly off to someone else's piece of abstract art. And if a male piece of art is rejected by like 3 females in a row, he gets irritated and brushes it all off with his wing, and then he makes another one. It's like, God. Well, they obviously have a very well developed sense of beauty. It's so cool, you know. And I guess the idea is that, who knows what the hell the idea is. The female birds like artistic males, something like that, but if you're thinking about it biologically, maybe it's an indication of intelligence, right? It's a marker of intelligence. You know, and it's certainly the case that female humans prefer creative men. So, and no wonder, of course. We wouldn't be creative if that wasn't the case. So then imagine that there's 2 primary forces of evolutionary selection operating on us, and they're not really the natural world, which is what people always think, like the environment, you know, the animals and the trees and nature. But it isn't nature that selected us. It's 2 other things. Well, partly. It's 2 other things. So one is the dominance hierarchy. The male dominance hierarchy is one of the primary mechanisms of selection. So it's like, women are faced with a hard choice, which guy to go after, right? That's a hard choice. Well, so they do the same thing that people do with the stock market. They outsource the cognitive problem, the computational problem, to the male dominance hierarchy. Then they just let the males sort themselves out, however they're going to, and then they peel from the top. And so what that means is the male dominance hierarchy itself is a selection mechanism, because if you fail at it, then you don't leave any offspring. And so what that means, at least in part, is that we have adapted to be better and better at attaining status in dominance hierarchies over God only knows how long a period of time. And that doesn't mean just power. You know, it might mean cognitive flexibility, because you could imagine dominance hierarchy A, dominance hierarchy B, dominance hierarchy C. Okay, so if you're really successful, you climb up dominance hierarchy A. Right, but B and C, no, if you happen to land in those, you'd just be a failure. So then you could say, the ideal human being is someone who can climb to the top of a dominance hierarchy, no matter what the dominance hierarchy is. We've evolved such that success across the set of possible dominance hierarchies is the target. And I think that's why we have general intelligence. Because general intelligence is a general problem-solving mechanism. And it's a single factor even. Like intelligence is a single factor. It's not divisible, despite what people like Robert Sternberg and Howard Gardner falsely claim. So, and then from the female perspective, females are the next gatekeeper. And that's why they're often Mother Nature. It took me a long time to figure this out. Why the hell is nature feminine in mythological representations? It's it's extraordinarily common. Mother Nature. You don't think of Father Nature, you think of Mother Nature. It's like, why? Well, nature brings forth new forms, so that's feminine. And nature selects. In fact, that's the definition of nature from a Darwinian perspective. Nature is that which selects. Women select their nature. And that's partly why far more men than you might think like far more, are terrified of women. Because to be rejected as a romantic partner by a woman is to be classified as vaguely acceptable life form. No value in propagating it though. Right, so it's a major rejection. And you know, I've had dozens of clients and many people write to me whose primary problem is that they're so terrified of women they can't even approach them. Very common. The selection mechanisms that determine what happens to you in relationship to the next generation, say, are selecting you on the basis of your action and your behavior. I would say they're selecting you on the basis of your values. So because, you know, if you're an idiot, say, and you go charging after a lion and the lion eats you, then the nature of reality, so to speak, has rendered a judgment on the value structure that sent you down that particular path, right? And so you're being selected by natural forces as a consequence of your behavior. Now, and then we can extend that argument, especially in the human case, or in the case of any organism that's also subject to sexual selection. And human beings are tremendously subject to sexual selection. Now, Darwin was a great believer in sexual selection. You know, he thought it was at least as important as the selection of the organism by the natural environment, whatever that is. But, you know, biologists really had a hard time with that. They kind of ignored sexual selection for like 100 years, which is quite interesting. I think it was partly because sexual selection implies, especially when you're dealing with organisms that are sort of conscious like human beings, that choice itself is a determinant of evolutionary processes. And you know, the strict deterministic materialists didn't really like that, and they couldn't really come up with an argument against it, but they sort of shelved the whole topic for a very long period of time. But one of the things we know, for example, about human beings is that females are very sexually selective, female humans, as opposed to, say, the female chimps, which aren't. So part of what's occurred to select human beings for the way they are is the choices that each gender has made with regards to action and belief, but in many ways more specifically female choices. So it's kind of interesting. The next time you're irritated at your boyfriend, let's say, then you can just remember that, you know, untold millions of women have chosen men so that they're exactly like he is, and so, you know, you can't really blame him for that. So all right, so but here's the thing that's tricky from a scientific perspective, eh? If it is your behavior and your value structures, if your value structures determine what you're interested in, how you behave, and selection pressure occurs as a consequence of your actions, then doesn't it mean that the structure of the value systems that drive your behavior have to be regarded as true or real in some scientific sense? Because the Darwinists basically say, look, the best solution is the solution that you embody. There is no higher solution than that. And there you are, embodying a solution. So it's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them. And then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be. It could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work, because like you got no shortage of flaws and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again. But maybe you can do it, and then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer, because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. So anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart. And so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree, and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented, and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and, you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry and, you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good, that sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. Then she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack, and so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know, and I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so what the females seem to be doing is using some marker or some set of markers as a proxy indicator for health. And I think you could say with reasonable, you could say reasonably that female human beings do the same thing to male human beings. And there's some of that vice versa too. Like we evaluate each other, for example, for symmetry, which is one of the elements of beauty, because healthier people tend to be more symmetrical, and lots of animals use symmetry. Butterflies, if butterflies won't mate with another butterfly if it deviates from symmetry by the tiniest amounts you can imagine. So symmetry is a marker, and there's other markers like shoulder width to waist width is one, and waist width to hip width is another. That's usually what males use that to evaluate females in part. So there's lots of markers of health. But it also looks to me like the data worldwide seems to indicate that women, so imagine that women mate across dominance hierarchies and up, socioeconomically speaking, and on average across cultures, women go for men who are about 4 to 5 years older. You know, it varies. In the Scandinavian countries, that's shrunk a little bit, but not that much. And in other cultures, it's bigger. I would say that depends to some degree on difficulty of establishing economic independence, right? Because in richer countries, it's easier to have enough economic independence if you're a male to be a useful participant in the process of having children. But it doesn't matter, cross-culturally, it's still across and up, where men mate across and down. They don't care much about socioeconomic status. It doesn't seem to be part of their selection method, generally speaking. So I think that part of that is also the ability of women to select for male health. It's something like that, because it isn't only that, because if you're healthy and energetic, you're much more likely to be successful, because it's very hard to be successful if you're ill, obviously. I mean, so because the competition is just too high. And both genders, both sexes select each other for attractiveness, both select for intelligence, both select for personality, although there are differences there in terms of what's stressed. But so I think you can derive a couple of things out of this, and this is where I think people are different than other animals. Importantly different is that, so you imagine that there's tremendous selection pressure towards the production, let's say, of men who are good at climbing male dominance hierarchies, or climbing the male dominance hierarchy. But the thing that's so interesting about people is that we've multiplied our dominance hierarchies. You know, if you take an animal that's got a rather static behavioral pattern, then there's a single hierarchy. Elephant seals are a good example of that. So elephant seals, the males are absolutely massive. They're way, way bigger than the females. And they basically have harems, roughly speaking. And they use physical prowess as their marker of status, essentially. And obviously size is a huge part of that, because otherwise the male elephant seals wouldn't be as... They're massive, these things. They're absolutely enormous. And so it's just power / health, you know, maybe aggression, something like that. It's whatever makes them more suitable for the kind of physical combat that elephant seals engage in. So, and the degree to which power is associated with dominance status in those sorts of situations seems to be associated with the size differential between males and females. So the more power is an issue with regards to male competence, the larger the males are compared to the females, and the more likely the males are going to have a harem relationship with the females. And you see that a little bit in human beings because men are bigger than women. They're not overwhelmingly bigger, that's sexual dimorphism. And you know, there's some men that are smaller than some women, but on average men are taller and they have more upper body strength and so forth. So there is a power element to male competition, but it's not as extended as it would be among animals, say like elephant seals. So in the elephant seal, you see maybe there's one stable set of traits that's being selected for that makes the males more likely to reproduce. But human beings, we're very weird creatures because we're so conceptually flexible. And so what seems to have happened, maybe males started selecting each other for in dominance competitions for something like cognitive flexibility and conscientiousness. It's something like that. So that would be the ability to abstractly represent the world, and then the ability to operate effectively within it, to represent yourself socially in a way, and then to carry through with that, because that enables people to trust you. So it's something like that. And so that produced cortical expansion, and then women were selecting men who were good at that, and that produced cortical expansion. And then there's an arms race between women and men with regards to intelligence. So the women kept up, or they certainly kept up with intelligence as the evolutionary cycle continued.